In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Well, we are working with the book Pragmatics and Discourse, written by John Cuddy. We are on page 21, and we want to continue. We want to finish speech acts. Okay, page 21 talks about cultural dimension. Well, in the speech act, there is a kind of consideration called cultural dimension. Well, if you actually go to the first line, you see speech acts and their linguistic realizations are culturally bound. The ways expressing speech act vary from country to country and from culture to culture. Okay, so it is, we say, culturally bound. Okay. There's an example with India and Britain here. In India, for example, line 2, the expressive speech act of praising and congratulating a person on their appearance can be realized by the words, "How fat you are." If you want to say that a person is very good, a person has got a good kind of, in fact, body, you say how fat you are. Okay, it is good if you are in fact talking in India. But what about Britain? What about Britain? It is not the same in Britain. If you are actually expressing this idea in India, it is good. Why? Because it's an indicator of prosperity and health. But you cannot do the same thing in Britain. Say how fat you are. If you say how fat you are deploring or criticizing the person. Why? Since the fashion and diet food industries and possibly health conditions condition many into thinking that slim is beautiful. Okay? If you're not fat, it is good. So the last line of this paragraph says, slim is beautiful in Britain, but fat is beautiful in India. What is the meaning of slim? Slim means it's a good word for thin. Thin is not so good, not so bad. But if you say something is somebody is slim, you mean he is not fat or she is not fat, and it is okay. So slim is beautiful in Britain is against Indian notation of saying how fat you are. So it's a kind of good thing, it's a kind of good speech act in India, but the same thing is problematic in Britain. Why? Because they have got two different cultures. Now, there's another example of cultural dimension. There's a very short conversation down there. But the speech acts are different from one person A and the other person B. Let us see. A talks to B and says, "Is Mr. Perez there? Is Mr. Perez there?" Okay, B says, "Yes, he is." Well, there's a conflict of speech act. When you say, "Is Mr. Perez there?" in English, you don't want to find whether he is there or not. You want to talk to him. You want to talk to him. But B takes it as a kind of speech act suggesting whether or not Mr. Perez is there or not. So that's why B says, yes, he is. But A wants something else. He wants to talk to him. So he continues to say, "Can I speak to him, please?" Why? Because B took it wrongly. He only thought that he was thinking that Mr. Perez is there or not. Why? Because of the culture. In one culture, is Mr. Perez there is considered to be a kind of, let's say, asking for somebody's presence. In another culture, it is you are asking whether you can talk to that person or not. So there are two types of speech acts, as you can see below it. Below the conversation, it is something like this. A's question, is Mr. Perez there, is intended as an indirect request for the hearer to bring Mr. Perez to the phone. So you take the phone and say, is Mr. Perez there? You want to ask him to come to the phone. But in this conversation, B considers something else, understands something else. B only hears an interrogative with a function of direct representative, checking whether Mr. Perez is at his place for work or not. So, one sentence like is Mr. Perez can have two different types of speech acts. Asking for the presence or asking for him to come to the telephone. Okay? Why? Because in one culture we have like this, and in another culture like that. The next topic is talking about the limitations of speech act theory, still on page 21. Okay, limitations of speech act theory. Let us see. The first line says, when we try to categorize utterances in terms of speech act, we often find that there's an overlap. There's an overlap between two things at the same time. That one utterance can fall into more than one macro class. This was the question I was supposed to answer in the group. If you want to, the answer is something like this. Sometimes there's an overlap between two speech acts in one sentence. Okay? That one utterance can fall into more than one macro clause, sometimes two, sometimes maybe three or more. Take the following example from the novel Lord of the Flies. Okay, let us see. They are all dead, said Peggy. And this is an island. Nobody don't know we are here. Your dad don't know. Nobody don't know. Okay. First of all, remember, line 1 talks about a and an apostrophe. What does it mean? An here means and, line 1. And this is an island. This is an and, remember, because this is a kind of conversation. In the conversation, they don't say and, they say n, and they write it like this, with a and n, and after that an apostrophe. Okay, and because it is a kind of conversation between guys, we don't say nobody doesn't know. We say it is a kind of substandard English, and they say things like nobody don't know, not nobody doesn't know. Anyway. Nobody don't know where we are. Where we are here. Your dad don't know. Nobody don't know. Okay? Now, it is line 3. His lips quivered and the spectacles were dimmed with mist. The spectacles with damned with mist. Okay? We may stay here till we die. Okay, just wait. Look at this conversation to find out about the overlap. Let's go to page 22. 22, page 22 says the answer, how and why we think that there's an overlap. Line 1. On the face of it, this is a description of the present state of affairs. When the boy realizes that they all are alone on an island, and yet it is very emotive little outburst. Why? The boy is crying. The boy is crying. He's left in an island. He is left in an island. Maybe they are going to die there, as he actually comes to say. The boy is obviously crying, line 3 continues to say. So it could also be classified as expressive. Back to 21. This conversation at the end of the page shows an overlap between two things, a representative or an expressive. Which one is right? Both. Why? Because sometimes we have overlaps. Okay, this is one kind of limitation of speech act theory. This is number 1. Number 2, another problem. Let's go back to page 22, line 5, the new paragraph. Another problem with the speech act model is that it has no provision for the messy day of everyday spoken language. When we write everything, it is clear. You go to an office and write a kind of request. You apply. Everything is so clear. Then when you write a book, you actually write everything clearly. But when we talk, we are a bit messy. We are messy, okay? So everyday spoken language is full of these types of messiness. Examples of messiness. Number 1. Line 2 of the new paragraph says utterances such as, there you go. What is the meaning? No meaning. There you go. So there you go. No meaning. And you know, no meaning. Well, these are fillers, F-I-L-L-E-R-S, line 3, fillers, that say very little. These are only functioning as things that are put in the conversation. Okay, well, you know, so there you go. These are only fillers. They don't say anything. You want to, in fact, finish the conversation with. You actually want to fill the, in fact, empty places in the conversation. You don't want to have silence. You want to say that you are saying something. So you have fillers. Fillers are examples of messiness of everyday language. Why? Because they don't have any kind of meaning. Line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Line 5 says, this type of utterance has an interactional, socially cohesive function of avoiding silence. When you put words like these types of things, so there you go, or you say, you know, you want to, in fact, avoid silence, simply, with no meaning, okay? So that all speakers feel comfortable, line 5, I suppose, yes. And it is intensive, and it intensifies the relevance of surrounding utterances, okay? The things that are around the utterances. Number 2. In everyday spoken language, number 1 was fillers. Number 2, back channels and feedback. What are back channels and feedback? Let's see. Back channels and feedbacks are the responses that show that the hearer is listening and encouraging a speaker to continue talking. Okay, I am talking, you are listening to me. What do? You say things to encourage me to continue talking. When you are talking, I say things that helps you to continue talking. We call these things as back channels and feedback. Okay? Well, suppose that you say something and I say, was it? Was it? This is a back channel. Why? Because if I say what was it, you continue to say, continue to what you wanted to say. Okay? Or sometimes you say, oh, really? Again, this is another instance of back channels. Okay? Number 3, incomplete sentences. Incomplete sentences. So we say the same goes for incomplete sentences. Number 1 is fillers. Number 2 is back channels and feedback. Number 3 is incomplete sentences. As in, but she didn't know the no. This is a good kind of sentence. This is a good kind of utterance in your spoken language. Well, what does it say? Nothing. It's incomplete. It is incomplete. But we have to know that in everyday conversation, we have these types of messy sentences. Okay? Messy types of, incomplete sentences, which is a kind of messiness of everyday spoken language. So, everyday spoken language is not so neat and tidy. Now, I am almost finished with this type of things that are problems with, limitations of, or problems of speech act theory. Now we want to, in fact, give a kind of general idea about all speech acts. Well, let's go to macro functions. Macro functions mean big functions of speech acts. Well, generally, there are two types of speech act. There are two types of speech act. One is transactional type function of speech acts, and the other is the interactional. Let us read. Go to page 22. Finally, the last paragraph, beginning with macro functions as the topic. Finally, it should be noted that over and above speech acts, there are two main macro classes. Okay, macro functions. Brown and Yule, 1983, Brown and Yule describe them as transactional and interactional, as I told you. The transactional is the function which language serves in expressions of content and transmission of factual information. Well, you know something, you give these types of things to somebody else. It's like the news program on the television. Okay? But interactional is quite different. Interactional is quite different. Let us see. Page 23, line 1 says the interactional is that function involved in expressing social relations and personal attitudes, showing solidarity and maintaining social cohesion. When you talk to each other, you are interacting with each other. You want to show your personal attitudes, your ideas. You want to show that you are in the same boat, on the same boat with somebody else, that you are a friend of him, you are a friend of her. Okay? And maintaining social cohesion. You want to, in fact, keep in that kind of thing called society. You are part of the society, or an element, a member of the society, and want to, in fact, talk with others. So this kind of talking to others and receiving talks from others is interactional, but transactional is like teacher teaching. Like, let's say, teacher is teaching, everybody is listening, and is, in fact, the teacher is transacting, in fact, sending information to the kids, to the adults. But interactional, you don't want to send information. You want to be, in fact, sociable. You want to, in fact, talk to somebody in order to, in fact, say that you are not alone, that you have got the other person is a friend of yours, etc., etc. These are interactional. Okay? And the last but not the least, sometimes we have a mixture of the two things, like transactional and interactional, which the last paragraph talks about this kind of thing. In fact, most talk has a mixture of two functions. Well, a combination of interactional and sometimes transactional. There seems to be a climb from the purely transactional to the purely interactional. It's something like this. Okay? Like at the extreme end of the transactional end is the language used when a policeman is giving directions to travelers. Transactional. And a doctor is telling a nurse how to administer medicine to a patient. Okay? The doctor talks to the nurse about the patient, how to give the medication to the patient. Okay? At the extreme end of, well, this is transactional, more transactional, less interactional. And at the extreme end of the transaction is what is known as fatigue communion, talking and talking only. Language with no information, content, no information content. Used purely to keep channels of communication open. People are like this, okay? And it appears to be something like this, that the person is going to talk with no purpose, okay? So we call this as fatigue communion. Fatigue communion. What is fatigue communion? When you say, how are you? How are you? You don't want to know whether the person is sick or not. The person needs hospitalization or not. Okay? You don't want to know whether the person has got something like a coronavirus. No. How are you doesn't seem to be something like that. It's only a fatigue communion. You want to keep conversation open. Suppose you are, in fact, traveling from one city to another city, and there's the bus. There's a person to your left or to your right. And you know that it makes you tired to keep sitting in the bus, traveling from one province to another, from one city to another, from one part of the country to the other. What do? You want to talk. You only want to keep the channel of communication open with somebody who is a stranger. You say things like, how are you? What was the weather like yesterday? Well, it was cold, hot. It was raining. It was full of dust, etc., etc. You don't want to inform him, and he doesn't want to receive information from you. What is it? You only want to have fatigue communion. You want to talk. Okay? So, in the conversation below, you simply see this example as, my goodness, it's cold. Line 2 of the conversation, the text below. My goodness, it's cold. It's kind of fatigue communion, okay? Which is purely interactional, not transactional. You don't want to say that it's cold, because you see that the person has got a very nice pullover, a very nice and expensive pullover, which is used during the winter, and there's an overcoat. Okay? So you don't want to say it's cold. You only want to keep the communication open. That's it. Thank you very much. This is the end of page 23 with a discussion on speech act theory. Well, this is the beginning of conversation. We want to talk about topics on, in fact, conversation. Thank you very much.